It is February 11th, 2011, in Espoo, Finland, and inside the headquarters of the world's largest phone maker, an internal memo has just gone out to every employee. Its author is not Finnish. He is a Canadian executive named Stephen Alaup, hired from Microsoft 5 months earlier, and the memo he has written compares his own company to a burning oil platform. A man standing on a rig engulfed in flames who must choose between staying and dying or leaping into freezing water and hoping to survive. Nokia, he tells his own workforce, is on burning fire. Employees leak the memo to the press within hours. The stock drops the next morning. And the strangest part is that nothing in the memo is technically wrong. The company that once sold more phones than every competitor on Earth combined was, in fact, burning. What makes the story strange is what the company used to be before phones existed at all. It started in a forest, on a river, grinding wood into paper. If this is your kind of story, subscribe and hit like, because the company that put a mobile phone in 1 billion pockets began 150 years earlier making pulp for newsprint, and the road from a Finnish riverbank to a burning oil platform is one of the strangest arcs in the history of technology. In 1865, a mining engineer named Fredrik Idestam built a wood pulp mill on the banks of the Nokian Virta River in southwestern Finland. The town nearby lent its name to the operation, and Idestam's company grew steadily through the late 19th century, supplying paper to a continent industrializing on a diet of newsprint and packaging. For decades, Nokia had nothing to do with electricity, let alone telephones. In 1898, a separate company called Finnish Rubber Works was founded, producing galoshes, tires, and industrial rubber goods. And it eventually took the Nokia name because the pulp mill's location gave the brand a recognizable identity. In 1912, a third company, Finnish Cable Works, was founded to supply the telegraph and electrical cable lines Finland's modernizing infrastructure demanded. 3 separate Finnish companies, paper, rubber, and cable, increasingly intertwined through shared ownership. In 1967, they formally merged into a single conglomerate called Nokia Corporation, a sprawling industrial giant making truck tires, rubber boots, toilet paper, television sets, and electrical cable, with almost no coherent identity beyond being Finnish and being large. The seed of everything that followed was planted inside the cable division. In the 1960s, an engineer and eventual company president named Bjorn Westerlund pushed Finnish Cable Works into electronics research, a decision that looked at the time like a curiosity rather than a strategy. Nokia's electronics department began building radio telephones for the Finnish military and experimenting with data transmission equipment, a tiny outpost of engineers inside a company whose income still came overwhelmingly from tires and paper. In 1979, Nokia formed a joint venture with the television manufacturer Salora called Mobira, dedicated specifically to mobile telephony. 2 years later, in 1981, Nokia and its Nordic partners launched the Nordic Mobile Telephone Network, the first international cellular network in the world, allowing a car phone purchased in Helsinki to work in Stockholm or Oslo. Mobira built the Senator, a car-mounted mobile telephone weighing more than 9 kilograms in 1982. In 1984, the company released the Mobira Talkman, a portable phone that could be carried rather than bolted to a dashboard, though calling it portable required a generous definition of the word, since it weighed nearly 5 kilograms and came housed in its own shoulder bag. Then, in 1987, Nokia released the Mobira Cityman 900, a phone that could genuinely be held in one hand, and it became famous through an accident of diplomacy. That year, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was photographed making a call on a city man from Helsinki to Moscow, and the image circulated worldwide, turning an obscure Finnish handset into a symbol of the mobile future. Employees began calling it the Gorba phone. It cost roughly the same as a small car. Nobody at the company yet understood they were sitting on the future of the entire corporation. Through the 1980s, Nokia remained what it had always been, a diversified industrial conglomerate, and the mobile phone division was one experimental unit among many, competing for capital against television manufacturing, cable production, and rubber goods. The company expanded aggressively and chaotically, acquiring businesses across Europe with little strategic focus, and by the end of the decade, it was drowning in debt and internal confusion. In December 1988, Nokia's chief executive, Kari Karamo, died by suicide, a tragedy that left the company without clear leadership at the exact moment a brutal Finnish recession was beginning. The early 1990s brought a banking crisis, a collapse in trade with the newly dissolved Soviet Union, one of Finland's most important export markets, and Nokia's stock price fell toward irrelevance. The board considered breaking the company apart entirely. Instead, in 1992, they promoted a 41-year-old executive named Jorma Ollila to chief executive. Ollila had run the mobile phone division since 1990 and had watched, with more clarity than almost anyone else in the company, what was coming. He argued for something that sounded reckless to a board still thinking in terms of tires and paper. Sell everything that is not telecommunications. Over the following years, Nokia divested its television business, its cable operations, its rubber and tire divisions, its personal computer line, stripping away more than a century of industrial identity to bet the entire company on a technology that, in 1992, most of the world still associated with car phones for wealthy executives. It was, by any conventional business logic, an enormous risk. Ollila's bet rested on a single technical standard. In the late 1980s, European governments and telecom operators had agreed to build a unified digital cellular standard called GSM, Global System for Mobile Communications, designed to let a phone bought in one European country work seamlessly in every other. Nokia built the first commercial GSM phone, the Nokia 1011, launched in November 1992, named for the date of its release, the 10th of November. Digital signals meant clearer calls, longer battery life, and, crucially, smaller and lighter handsets than the analog phones that had come before. Nokia had bet the company on telecommunications at the exact moment telecommunications was about to become a mass consumer product rather than a business tool, and the timing turned out to be close to perfect. The company Ollila built moved with a speed that older, more diversified Nokia never could have managed. In 1994, the Nokia 2110 introduced a navigation menu that let users personalize ringtones and screen text, a small design touch that made the phone feel less like an industrial instrument and more like a personal object. Revenue climbed. In 1998, Nokia passed Motorola to become the largest mobile phone manufacturer on Earth, a position built on manufacturing scale, aggressive design, and a series of handsets that entered popular culture in a way no phone had before. The Nokia 6110, released in 1997, shipped with a built-in game called Snake, a primitive line-chasing puzzle that would occupy the idle hours of an entire global generation waiting in line at the bank or riding the bus. In 1999, Nokia released the 3210, the first phone with an internal antenna, giving it a smooth, pocket-friendly silhouette that competitors scrambled to copy. It sold roughly 160 million units. A year later came the phone that would outlast every other object Nokia ever built in the popular imagination, the Nokia 3310, released in September 2000. It was not fast. It was not sophisticated. What it was nearly indestructible, a slab of plastic and circuitry that could survive being dropped from a moving car, run over, or thrown across a room, and the internet would spend the next 2 decades building memes around exactly that reputation. Nokia sold roughly 126 million units of the 3310 and its immediate successors. By 2000, Nokia's market capitalization briefly touched roughly 250 billion euros, making it, for a period, the single most valuable company in Europe. A Finnish firm with a population base smaller than metropolitan London, commanding a stock valuation larger than most entire national economies of the region it called home. By 2007, Nokia controlled close to half of the entire global mobile phone market, selling roughly 435 million handsets a year, more units annually than any consumer electronics company had ever moved in human history. Its phones ran across more than 150 countries. In sub-Saharan Africa, in rural India, in villages with no landline infrastructure at all, a Nokia handset was often the first telephone a family had ever owned, durable enough to survive dust, heat, and drops onto concrete floors, cheap enough to be sold for the equivalent of a week's wages. The company employed over 100,000 people, and Finland's entire national economy bent visibly around its success. At its peak, Nokia alone was responsible for roughly a quarter of Finland's total research and development spending, and a meaningful share of its export revenue and stock market value. Finnish schoolchildren studied engineering with the explicit hope of one day working at Espoo. The company was not merely a business. It had become, for a small Nordic nation of 5 million people, a kind of national identity. Nokia had also built something less visible than the handsets themselves, a smartphone operating system called Symbian, developed through a consortium formed in 1998 with Pion, Ericsson, and Motorola, though Nokia quickly became its dominant force and eventual sole owner. Symbian ran on Nokia's higher-end communicator and N-series devices, phones that could browse the web and sync email years before the term smartphone had entered mainstream vocabulary. By the mid-2000s, Symbian was the most widely used smartphone operating system on the planet, and inside Nokia's Espoo campus, executives believed, with genuine conviction, that they understood the smartphone market better than any company alive. This confidence would prove to be the single most expensive misjudgment in the company's history. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and introduced the iPhone, a phone with no physical keyboard, no stylus, and a touchscreen interface built around fingers rather than styluses or number pads. Inside Nokia, the reaction was not panic. It was, by most later accounts, closer to dismissal. Nokia executives had already experimented with touchscreens and had concluded that consumers, conditioned by a decade of physical keypads, preferred tactile buttons for typing and would not accept a glass screen as a primary input method, particularly for a device meant to survive being dropped in a bar or a factory floor. Nokia's own head of markets, Anssi Vanjoki, was widely reported to have compared the iPhone unfavorably to Nokia's existing lineup, suggesting it was a niche product for a narrow slice of technology enthusiasts rather than a mass market threat. You can read that judgment 2 ways, and honest history holds both at once. One reading says Nokia's executives were arrogant, blinded by a decade of uncontested dominance, unable to imagine that the rules of their own industry could change beneath them. The other reading says the skepticism was not unreasonable at the time, since touchscreen phones genuinely had struggled commercially before, since Apple had no experience manufacturing telecommunications hardware at global scale, and since Nokia's own market research, drawn from hundreds of millions of real customers, genuinely did show a strong preference for physical keyboards, particularly outside wealthy Western markets. Both things were true. The iPhone was, at launch, a limited product running on a slow cellular network with no third-party app store and a battery life inferior to Nokia's own devices. And it was also the beginning of the end. What made the threat lethal was not the hardware. It was the software underneath it and the ecosystem Apple built around it. The iPhone's App Store, launched in 2008, turned the phone into a platform rather than a device, and developers who had once written applications for Symbian, widely regarded even inside Nokia as clunky and fragmented across device variants, began abandoning it in favor of Apple's cleaner environment. Google, meanwhile, had acquired a small startup called Android in 2005, and by 2008 was distributing an open-source mobile operating system that any handset manufacturer could adopt for free. Nokia found itself squeezed from two directions at once: a closed, beautifully integrated premium product from Apple above, and an open, rapidly improving, zero-cost operating system from Google spreading below. Nokia's response was neither swift nor unified. It poured resources into Symbian upgrades that arrived late and still felt dated, while simultaneously funding a second, more ambitious operating system called MeeGo, developed jointly with Intel. MeeGo shipped on essentially one flagship device, the N9, released in 2011, to strong reviews and almost no market impact, arriving after the strategic decision that would make it irrelevant had already been made. Nokia was building two future operating systems at once, while its current one bled market share, and neither effort moved fast enough to matter. By 2010, Nokia's smartphone market share, once dominant, was eroding month over month, and the board made a decision that stunned Finland. In September of that year, they hired Stephen Elop as chief executive, the first non-Finn ever to lead the company in its 145-year history, and, more pointedly, an executive who had spent the previous 2 years running Microsoft's business division. Elop arrived in Espoo already carrying the fingerprints of a rival company, and 5 months later, in February 2011, he sent the memo that would define his tenure and, in the eyes of many Finns, define the company's decline. The Burning Platform memo described Nokia's competitive position in stark, almost brutal terms, comparing the company to an oil worker on a burning rig who must jump into freezing water, not because the water offers safety, but because staying still guarantees death. Nokia, Elop wrote, was losing ground on nearly every front, high-end to Apple, low-end to cheaper Asian manufacturers, developers to Android, and the company's own internal culture, he argued, had grown too slow, too bureaucratic, too consensus-driven to respond. The memo leaked to the press within hours, and the reaction inside Finland was immediate and furious. Employees felt blindsided by a leader who seemed to be publicly diagnosing his own company as terminal. The stock, which had already fallen sharply, dropped further the next trading day, a self-inflicted wound that many Nokia veterans have never fully forgiven. 11 days after the memo leaked, Elop announced the strategic decision it had been building toward. Nokia would abandon Symbian and MeeGo entirely and adopt Microsoft's Windows Phone as its primary smartphone operating system, forming a deep partnership with the company Elop had left less than a year earlier. Microsoft would pay Nokia over $1 billion in platform support payments over the following years, and Nokia would build its future smartphone line, branded Lumia, entirely around Microsoft's software. You can read this decision two ways as well. and honest history holds both readings simultaneously. One reading says the choice was rational triage, an honest acknowledgement that Nokia could not build a competitive third ecosystem alone against Apple and Google's combined weight, and that partnering with a well-capitalized giant offered the fastest path back to relevance. The other reading, the one many former Nokia engineers have voiced in the years since, says Alup was a Microsoft executive placed inside a rival company who steered that company's fate directly into his former employer's arms, whether through genuine strategic conviction or unavoidable institutional bias, and that the decision itself triggered the very death spiral it claimed to be preventing, since consumers and developers alike interpreted the announcement as confirmation that Nokia's own platforms were already dead, accelerating a collapse in Symbian sales that had not yet been inevitable. Whatever the intent, the market reacted instantly. Symbian device sales, which still represented the overwhelming majority of Nokia's smartphone revenue in early 2011, fell off a cliff within months as consumers stopped buying phones running an operating system the company itself had just declared obsolete. The first Lumia devices arrived in late 2011, and reviewers largely praised them, citing sharp cameras, a clean and colorful interface, and solid build quality inherited from Nokia's decades of hardware engineering. The reviews did not translate into sales at the scale Nokia needed. Windows Phone struggled with the same problem that had doomed MeeGo, a chronic shortage of third-party applications, since developers had limited incentive to build for a platform with a small and shrinking user base when Apple's and Google's app stores offered vastly larger audiences for the same investment of engineering time. Nokia's overall handset market share, close to 40% globally in 2007, fell to roughly 15% by 2011 and continued sliding towards single digits over the following 2 years. The company's stock, which had traded above 40 euros a share in 2007, fell below 2 euros by the summer of 2012, a decline of more than 95%. Standard and Poor's cut Nokia's credit rating to junk status that same year. The company that had once been worth more than most national economies in its own region was now valued at a fraction of what it had been a decade earlier, and layoffs followed at a scale that reshaped entire Finnish towns built around Nokia manufacturing and research sites. Between 2011 and 2013, the company cut more than 40,000 jobs worldwide, a significant share of them in Finland itself, and towns like Salo, which had grown almost entirely around a Nokia factory, watched their local economies contract overnight. By 2013, the strategic bet on Windows Phone had not reversed the decline, and Nokia's board made the decision that ended the company's 33-year run as a phone manufacturer. In September 2013, Microsoft announced it would acquire Nokia's Devices and Services division, the entire mobile phone business, for approximately 5.4 billion euros, roughly $7.2 billion, a sale that included the Lumia smartphone line, the aging feature phone business, and a license to Nokia's design patents, though critically not the Nokia brand itself, which the parent company retained. Stephen Elop returned to Microsoft as part of the deal, stepping back into the company he had left 3 years earlier, and departed Nokia with an exit package reported at close to $25 million, a figure that struck many observers, and a great many Finns in particular, as a strange reward for presiding over the collapse of a national institution. Microsoft's chief executive at the time, Steve Ballmer, described the acquisition as a bold step into a future of higher volume and higher value. The future did not arrive as promised. Microsoft rebranded the devices simply as Microsoft Mobile, continued the Lumia line for roughly 2 more years, and struggled with the same application gap that had haunted Windows Phone since its launch. In July 2015, Microsoft wrote down $7.6 billion related to the Nokia acquisition, close to the entire purchase price, and laid off thousands of employees from the former Nokia workforce it had inherited. By 2016, Microsoft had effectively exited the phone hardware business entirely, and the once largest phone maker on Earth had within a single decade been absorbed by a rival, gutted, and quietly discontinued. What remained of Nokia after the sale was not nothing. The parent company had spent years before the sale building a second identity through Nokia Siemens Networks, later renamed Nokia Networks, a joint venture and eventual wholly owned subsidiary focused on the telecommunications infrastructure that carriers use to actually run their cellular networks, the towers, switches, and core systems, rather than the handsets that connect to them. In 2016, Nokia acquired the French-American infrastructure giant Alcatel-Lucent for roughly 16 billion euros, transforming itself into one of the world's largest suppliers of network equipment, competing directly with Ericsson and China's Huawei for the contracts to build out 4G and eventually 5G infrastructure across the globe. It is today a legitimate and profitable business generating billions in annual revenue, though one almost entirely invisible to ordinary consumers, since nobody unboxes a cell tower. The consumer-facing Nokia brand did not disappear either. In 2016, a newly formed company called HMD Global, founded by former Nokia executives and based fittingly in Espoo, licensed the Nokia name and began releasing Android smartphones under the old brand. In 2017, HMD released a modern relaunch of the Nokia 3310, capitalizing on the internet's enduring affection for the original's indestructible reputation, and the nostalgia-driven device generated a wave of positive press disproportionate to its modest sales. It was not, in any meaningful sense, the same company that had once employed 100,000 people and commanded half the planet's phone market. It was a licensing arrangement wearing a beloved name. The human legacy of Nokia's collapse turned out to be larger than the corporate one. Tens of thousands of engineers, designers, and software developers who had spent careers building phones inside Espoo's research campuses were suddenly available to a Finnish technology ecosystem that had, until that point, been almost entirely defined by a single employer. Finland's government and private investors moved to soften the blow, funding retraining programs and startup incubators aimed specifically at absorbing former Nokia talent, and the results reshaped the country's economy in ways few predicted. Rovio, the studio behind Angry Birds, had actually been founded years earlier by university students, but its explosive 2009 success coincided directly with Nokia's decline and drew heavily on engineers who understood mobile hardware and constraints intimately. Supercell, founded in 2010 by veterans of the Finnish gaming and telecom industries, grew into one of the most valuable mobile game studios in the world, eventually valued at several $billion. Slush, a Helsinki startup and technology conference founded in 2008 by a small group of entrepreneurs, grew from a modest gathering into one of Europe's largest startup events, drawing thousands of founders and investors to Finland every November, a direct cultural byproduct of a generation of engineers who had learned to build hardware and software at a global company and then had to reinvent themselves outside it. Finnish policymakers and economists have since studied the Nokia collapse as something closer to a controlled demolition than a catastrophe, a painful but ultimately productive redistribution of talent that seeded an entire new generation of Finnish technology companies, even as it devastated the specific towns and families who had built careers assuming Nokia would exist forever. The devices themselves refused to disappear quietly. The Nokia 3310 remains, to this day, one of the most referenced consumer electronics products in internet culture, a permanent fixture of jokes about indestructibility, still surfacing in memes about surviving apocalypses that would presumably destroy every other object on Earth. Second-hand 3310 phones and 3210 phones still circulate on resale markets. Some purchased not out of nostalgia, but out of genuine practicality, since a phone with a battery that lasts a week and a body that can survive being run over remains, for certain uses, a genuinely superior tool to a modern smartphone that must be charged nightly and cracks if dropped onto tile. Snake, the primitive game bundled onto the Nokia 6110 in 1997, has been rebuilt, cloned, and referenced across nearly every gaming platform that followed. A piece of interactive design so simple it became immortal, precisely because it required nothing from the hardware running it. Nokia's ringtones, particularly the descending guitar riff, known simply as the Nokia tune, adapted from a 19th century Spanish classical guitar piece called Gran Vals, are still instantly recognizable to anyone who owned a mobile phone in the late 1990s or early 2000s. A sound that once played in pockets, bags, and meeting rooms across the entire planet, hundreds of millions of times a day at the company's peak. Nokia did not lose to the iPhone because it failed to see the future coming. Nokia had, in fact, already built pieces of that future. Touchscreen prototypes, app ecosystems, internet-connected handsets, years before Apple entered the phone business at all. What Nokia lost was the internal coordination to move all of those pieces in the same direction at the same speed. Trapped between an aging operating system it could not abandon fast enough and a next-generation platform it could not finish fast enough, run by a leadership team that ultimately handed its fate to the very company competing against it from the outside. Jorma Ollila had once bet an entire industrial conglomerate on the idea that telecommunications was the future, stripping away tires and paper and television sets to chase a market that, in 1992, barely existed yet, and the bet had built the most successful consumer electronics company Europe had ever produced. 2 decades later, a different leadership team faced a strategic choice of comparable magnitude, and the outcome ran the opposite direction entirely. The company that once put a phone in 1 billion pockets is, today, a network equipment supplier whose products the public will never hold in their hands, and a licensed brand name stamped onto phones built by engineers who never worked inside the original company at all. The riverbank in Nokia, Finland, still exists. The pulp mill that gave the company its name is long gone, and the small oval logo that once meant to more people on Earth than any other piece of consumer technology in history that a phone call was about to connect now sits mostly on cell towers nobody looks up to notice. If you owned a 3310 that survived a fall, no phone should survive. If you played Snake through an entire boring class period, if you remember the exact descending guitar notes of the Nokia tune going off in a quiet room, drop a comment below. Tell us the model, the year, and how many times you dropped it before it finally gave out. The people who carried these phones in their pockets for a decade know more about what Nokia actually built than any acquisition filing ever will. Subscribe, because this archive is still being built, and we have the story of another electronics empire coming next.